Hey guys, imagine your wedding night except there are witnesses in the room. Not metaphorically, literally standing there, watching, waiting to testify. In Tudor England, this wasn't some nightmare scenario. It was required for noble marriages. The bedding ceremony wasn't about romance or privacy. It was about proving consummation, ensuring heirs, and protecting property. What you weren't taught in history class is why this humiliating ritual was considered absolutely necessary. Tonight, we're pulling back those bed curtains. Hey guys, welcome back to Hearts and History. Before we dive in tonight, I need to tell you something that's going to change how you think about wedding nights forever. Imagine standing at the altar, saying your vows, and then having a dozen people follow you into your bedroom, not metaphorically. Literally standing there, watching, waiting to testify about what happens next. In Tudor England, this wasn't a nightmare, it was required, and the reasons why will absolutely shock you. Welcome back to Hearts and History, where we explore the uncomfortable truths about love through the ages. Before we begin, get comfortable, maybe grab some tea, dim the lights. If you enjoy these stories, hit subscribe, it really helps us keep digging up these forgotten pieces of history. And leave a comment, telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing you're out there, somewhere in the world, ready for another story about how strange the past really was. Let's get comfortable tonight as we pull back those heavy Tudor bed curtains together. If you're new here, please hit subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep these stories coming, and I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Are you in bed already? Walking the dog? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all here together, diving into history's strangest moments. Chapter 1. Witness to Wedlock. Tudor England, roughly 1485 to 1603, was a society obsessed with legitimacy. Henry VIII's desperate quest for a male heir shaped an entire nation's religious identity. But he wasn't unique. Every noble family lived in terror of disputed succession. Without clear heirs, properties reverted to the crown, titles died out, and decades of careful alliance building collapsed overnight. Marriage contracts were legal documents as complex as modern corporate mergers. Chapter 1. The startling wedding night ritual. England, 1547. Lady Margaret Clifford stands at her bedchamber door, still wearing her wedding dress, but her hands are shaking. Not from joy, from terror. Because behind her, 12 witnesses are filing into the room where she's about to spend her wedding night. Her new husband, a man she met 3 days ago, looks equally pale. This isn't romance, this is a legal requirement, and it's about to get much worse. Women had almost no legal existence outside of their relationships to men. Under Coverture, a married woman's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even be prosecuted separately for most crimes. But here's the crucial detail: an unconsummated marriage could be annulled. If a husband claimed impotence or a wife claimed non-consummation, the entire marriage and all its property transfers could be invalidated. Families needed proof. You need to understand something about Tudor marriage. Love was optional. Heirs were not. When Henry VIII tore apart the Catholic Church to divorce Catherine of Aragon, it sent shockwaves through every noble family in England. Suddenly, everyone became obsessed with one question: can your marriage be annulled? The answer often came down to a single humiliating factor. Could you prove consummation had actually occurred? Hence the witnesses, hence the watching, hence the absolute violation of privacy. The bedding ceremony followed a precise, humiliating protocol. After the wedding feast, the bride would be undressed by her female attendants, who examined her shift, that thin linen gown she wore to bed. They made sure it was modest yet accessible. Meanwhile, the groom was undressed by his male companions, often amid ribald jokes and advice. Contemporary accounts describe young men being given beverages laced with supposed aphrodisiacs, oysters, wine mixed with herbs, even pulverized gemstones. The ceremony followed precise rules. First, the bride's female attendants would undress her, examining her shift, that thin linen gown she'd wear to bed. It had to be modest yet accessible. Meanwhile, the groom's male companions stripped him down, often plying him with wine, laced with supposed aphrodisiacs, oysters, herbs, even pulverized gemstones they believed would enhance his. Imagine being a terrified teenager, about to be intimate for the first time, while a dozen strangers prepare you like some sacrificial offering. The couple would then be led to the marital bed by this entourage of witnesses, sometimes a dozen or more people. A priest would bless the bed, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers for fertility. The witnesses wouldn't leave immediately. They arranged themselves around the bedchamber, sometimes with curtains partially drawn for a semblance of privacy, but not so much that they couldn't testify to what occurred. When Princess Mary Tudor married Louis XII, dozens of courtiers witnessed. Then came the procession. The couple, barely clothed, would be led to their marriage bed by this entourage of witnesses. Family members, friends, sometimes the priest himself. They'd arrange themselves around the bedchamber, like spectators at a particularly invasive theatre performance. A priest would bless the bed, sprinkling holy water and muttering prayers for fertility. The curtains might be partially drawn for a whisper of dignity, but never enough to obstruct the witnesses' view. They needed to see. That was the entire point. What exactly did witnesses verify? They needed to confirm that the couple had been left alone in bed together, undressed. Some sources suggest they waited to hear sounds indicating consummation, though Tudor documentation stays delicately vague about details. For the highest-ranking marriages, witnesses might wait until the groom emerged to announce success, sometimes displaying the bloodied sheets as proof of the bride's virginity and consummation, a practice borrowed from earlier medieval traditions. For royal marriages, the spectacle was even grander. When Princess Mary Tudor married the King of France in 1514, dozens of courtiers witnessed her bedding ceremony. Can you imagine your most intimate moment becoming a state occasion? The higher your rank, the more witnesses you required. Dukes needed more proof than earls. Earls needed more than mere knights. Your privacy was literally inversely proportional to your importance. The more powerful your family, the less human you became. The psychological impact on young couples, often teenagers in arranged marriages meeting for the first time days earlier, can hardly be imagined. Letters from Elizabeth Talbot describe her daughter's terror on her wedding night in 1559, knowing that her ability to perform this intimate act under scrutiny would determine her entire future. The groom faced equal pressure. Failure to consummate could lead to accusations of impotence, annulment, and social humiliation that followed families for generations. What exactly were they witnessing? The witnesses needed to confirm several things: that the couple had been placed in bed together, that they were in a state of undress, that they'd been left alone for sufficient time. Some sources suggest they waited to hear sounds indicating success. Others describe grooms emerging to announce consummation. For the highest marriages, bloodied sheets might be displayed as proof, evidence of virginity lost, and marriage properly sealed. Medieval holdovers that survived well into the 1500s. The psychological damage was immense. These were often teenagers in arranged marriages, meeting their spouses for the first time just days earlier. Letters from the Countess of Shrewsbury describe her daughter's terror in 1559, knowing that her ability to perform this intimate act under scrutiny would determine her entire future. The pressure on grooms was equally crushing. Failure to consummate could lead to accusations of impotence, annulment, and complete social humiliation. Your manhood, literally on trial. The legal consequences were devastating when things went wrong. In 1561, Lady Katherine Grey's marriage was declared invalid, partly because there were no witnesses to her bedding. Her children became illegitimate overnight, removing them from royal succession. This was exactly what Elizabeth I wanted. The lack of witnesses became a convenient weapon. Similarly, when Henry VIII wanted to annul his marriage to Anne of Cleves, he claimed non-consummation. No witnesses meant no one could contradict him. Not everyone submitted willingly. Some less traditional families conducted token beddings. Witnesses would confirm the couple was placed in bed, then immediately leave, trusting their word about what followed. By the late 1500s, Protestant reformers began arguing this was an unseemly Catholic holdover with no biblical basis. These voices grew stronger during Elizabeth's reign, yet the practice persisted in royal circles well into the 1600s. Tradition dies hard when property and power are at stake. Common people experience something entirely different. Peasant and merchant weddings sometimes included bedding ceremonies, but with music and celebration rather than cold legal scrutiny. Actual witnesses were rare. The stakes weren't high enough to justify such invasion. This humiliation was reserved for those whose marriages involved significant property, titles, or political alliances. If your union could start wars or end dynasties, your bedroom became a courtroom. Privacy was a luxury only the powerless could afford. Women bore the heaviest burden. Under Tudor law, a married woman's legal identity disappeared into her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even be prosecuted separately for crimes. But an unconsummated marriage could be annulled, invalidating all property transfers. so families with fortunes at stake needed proof. Her body wasn't her own. It was a vessel for legitimate heirs, with sexuality policed by community oversight. Intimacy became evidence, pleasure became performance, love became law. The trauma rippled through generations, associations between intimacy and humiliation that some couples never overcame. Marriages that began with violation rarely bloomed into genuine partnership. Yet some couples found ways to reclaim their privacy afterward. Secret signals, quiet rebellions, small acts of tenderness that no witness could verify or invalidate. Love, when it grew, did so despite the system, not because of it. These tiny revolutions of the heart were perhaps the most courageous acts of all. The gradual disappearance of bedding ceremonies tells its own story. As marriage slowly shifted from purely economic to partly emotional institutions in the 1600s and 1700s, privacy became valued, romance began to matter. The rise of companionate marriage ideals coincided with these rituals fading away. When couples started choosing each other for love rather than just property, the need for public verification diminished. Intimacy could finally become intimate, but that transformation took centuries. As you settle in tonight, be grateful for the privacy we take for granted. For Tudor couples, the wedding night wasn't the beginning of their private life together. It was the most public verification of their union's validity. Those witnesses didn't stay out of voyeurism, but necessity in a world where legitimacy meant everything, and a woman's word meant nothing. Sweet dreams, knowing your bedroom belongs to you alone. Some freedoms are so basic we forget they were once luxuries. Chapter 2. Two become one. Tudor England lived in constant fear of one word: illegitimate. Every noble family knew that without clear succession, their entire world could crumble overnight. The king's court wasn't just obsessed with bloodlines, they were terrified of them. Because in a society where everything depended on who your father was, proving that connection became a matter of life and death. Picture this: your wedding night, but there are strangers in the room. Not hiding, not peering through windows, standing right there, watching, waiting to testify later in court if necessary. This wasn't some medieval nightmare. This was Tuesday night for Tudor nobility. The bedding ceremony wasn't about romance, it was about proof. Legal proof that would protect fortunes, secure bloodlines, and validate marriages worth more than entire kingdoms. Welcome to Hearts and History, where love gets complicated. When a noble died without proven heirs, something devastating happened. Properties didn't pass to distant relatives or loyal friends. They reverted straight to the crown. Titles that families had held for generations simply ended. Imagine building wealth and influence for decades, only to watch it all disappear because you couldn't prove your children were legitimate. This wasn't just about money, it was about survival. Tonight we're pulling back those heavy Tudor bed curtains to reveal truths your history teacher probably skipped. Between 1485 and 1603, marriage among the aristocracy was far too important to be left to the couple alone. Love? That was optional. Legal consummation witnessed by a dozen strangers? Absolutely required. In a world where disputed marriages could topple kingdoms, privacy was a luxury noble families simply couldn't afford. The stakes were that high. For women, the stakes were even higher. Under Tudor law, a wife had almost no legal existence. She was essentially property herself. But here's the terrifying catch. If a marriage went unconsummated, it could be annulled. Everything she brought to the marriage, every protection she thought she had, could vanish. One claim of non-consummation could destroy her completely. Tudor England lived in constant fear of illegitimate heirs. Henry VIII's frantic quest for a male successor wasn't unusual. It was Tuesday for every noble family. Without clear bloodlines, titles died, properties reverted to the crown, and decades of careful political alliances crumbled overnight. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, erasing all those property transfers, all those dowries, all those promises between powerful families. Proof of consummation became proof of legitimacy itself. Tudor marriage contracts read like modern corporate mergers. Pages of legal text covering dowries, jointures, property transfers, and what happened if either spouse died. These weren't romantic unions, they were business deals involving vast wealth and political power. And like any high-stakes contract, they needed verification, proof that all terms had been fulfilled. Under Tudor law, married women basically ceased to exist. The doctrine of coverture meant a wife's legal identity dissolved into her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even be prosecuted separately for most crimes. But here's the crucial detail: an unconsummated marriage could be declared invalid. That meant every major family fortune depended on proving that intimate act had actually occurred. Witnesses weren't there for entertainment. They were there for evidence. That proof required witnesses, not to the ceremony, but to what happened after. In bedchambers across Tudor England, the most intimate moment of a couple's life became a legal necessity, because in a world where legitimacy meant everything, and a woman's word meant nothing, consummation needed to be verified by others. The wedding night wasn't private, it was evidence. The bedding ceremony followed precise, humiliating protocol. After the wedding feast, female attendants would undress the bride, examining her shift, that thin linen gown she'd wear to bed. Meanwhile, male companions undressed the groom, plying him with wine laced with supposed aphrodisiacs, oysters, herbs, even pulverized gemstones thought to enhance performance. Contemporary accounts from the 1540s describe young men terrified they wouldn't perform under pressure. They had good reason to worry. Picture the walk to that marriage bed. A dozen witnesses, sometimes more, escorting two often terrified teenagers who'd met days earlier. A priest would bless the bed, sprinkling holy water, saying prayers for fertility. Then the witnesses would arrange themselves around the chamber. Curtains might be partially drawn for modesty, but not enough to block their view completely. When Princess Mary Tudor married Louis XII in 1514, dozens of French courtiers witnessed her bedding. What exactly did these witnesses need to verify? They confirmed the couple had been placed in bed together, undressed, and left alone. Some sources suggest they waited to hear sounds indicating consummation, though Tudor documentation remained delicately vague. For royal marriages, witnesses sometimes waited until the groom emerged to announce success. Occasionally, bloodied sheets would be displayed as proof of both virginity and consummation, a medieval tradition that persisted in European courts. The psychological toll on these young couples is almost impossible to imagine. Letters from Elizabeth Talbot describe her daughter's terror on her 1559 wedding night. Knowing her ability to perform this intimate act under scrutiny would determine her entire future. The groom faced equal pressure. Failure to consummate could mean accusations of impotence, annulment, social humiliation. Some couples never recovered from this traumatic introduction to married life. When consummation couldn't be proven, legal consequences followed swiftly. Lady Katherine Grey's 1561 marriage to Edward Seymour was declared invalid, partly because no witnesses attended the bedding. Their children became illegitimate, removed from succession, exactly what Elizabeth I wanted. The missing witnesses became a convenient legal weapon. Henry VIII used the same tactic against Anne of Cleves in 1540, claiming he'd dismissed witnesses wanting privacy, making non-consummation impossible to disprove. Not everyone submitted willingly to this ritual. Some progressive noble families conducted token beddings. Witnesses confirmed the couple was placed in bed, then immediately departed, trusting their word about what followed. By Elizabeth I's reigns, Protestant reformers argued the ceremony was unseemly Catholic tradition with no biblical basis. These voices grew louder, though royal circles maintained the practice well into the 1600s. Change came slowly for the most powerful families. Common people experienced something entirely different. Peasant and merchant weddings sometimes included festive processions escorting couples to their chambers with music and celebration. But actual witnesses? Rarely. The legal stakes weren't high enough to justify the intrusion. This particular humiliation was reserved for those whose marriages involved significant property, titles, or political alliances. Money and power demanded proof. Simple love could exist in private. The bedding ceremony reveals uncomfortable truths about aristocratic marriage. It wasn't a romantic union. It was a property transaction where love, if it developed, was considered fortunate, bonus. Women's bodies became vessels for legitimate heirs, their sexuality policed by community oversight. The trauma of public consummation undoubtedly scarred countless marriages, creating associations between intimacy and humiliation that some couples never overcame. Romance was luxury they couldn't afford. Interestingly, bedding ceremonies gradually disappeared as companionate marriage ideals emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries. Privacy and romance became valued only when marriage began shifting from purely economic to partially emotional institutions. The correlation isn't coincidental. As women gained legal recognition and marriage became less about property transfer, the need for witnessed consummation faded. Love required privacy, something Tudor aristocrats couldn't imagine their marriages including. Consider how this shaped an entire generation's understanding of intimacy. Young nobles learned that their most private moments were subject to public scrutiny, and legal verification, that their bodies weren't their own, but instruments of family ambition, that love was secondary to legitimacy, privacy less important than proof. Is it any wonder that many Tudor marriages were described as cold, formal arrangements? The system created exactly the loveless unions it claimed to protect. The witnesses themselves carried heavy responsibility. Their testimony could validate or invalidate marriages, legitimize or bastardize children, preserve or destroy family fortunes. They had to remain sober enough to remember details, discreet enough to avoid gossip, yet prepared to testify in court years later if disputes arose. Many were relatives or trusted family allies, chosen for loyalty rather than comfort with the situation. Their presence made private moments public legal proceedings. As you settle in tonight, be grateful for the privacy we take for granted in our most intimate moments. For Tudor couples, the wedding night wasn't the beginning of private life together. It was the most public verification of their union's validity. Witnesses stayed, not from curiosity, but necessity. In a world where legitimacy meant everything, and a woman's word meant nothing. Rest well, knowing your bedroom is yours alone. Chapter 3. Rituals of the Tudor Bedchamber. Picture this. Your wedding night, but there are witnesses in the room, not metaphorically, literally standing there, watching, waiting to testify. In Tudor England, this wasn't some nightmare scenario for noble couples. It was absolutely required by law. The bedding ceremony wasn't about romance or privacy. It was about proving consummation, ensuring legitimate heirs, protecting vast property holdings. What happened behind those heavy curtains would determine the legal validity of entire dynastic alliances. The stakes couldn't be higher. The year is 1509, and 18-year-old Henry VIII has just inherited the throne. Within weeks, he marries Catherine of Aragon, not for love, but because his dying father arranged it. Henry needs an heir, not just any child, a son. In Tudor England, a daughter meant weakness, uncertainty, civil war. Every noble family understood this terror. Without a legitimate male heir, kingdoms crumbled, properties vanished, bloodlines ended. Marriage wasn't about happiness, it was about survival, and Henry would tear England apart to get his boy. The ritual followed a precise, humiliating protocol. After the wedding feast ended, the bride was undressed by her female attendants, who examined her shift, that thin linen gown she'd wear to bed. They made sure it was modest yet accessible. Meanwhile, the groom was undressed by his male companions, often amid crude jokes and advice. Young men were given beverages laced with supposed aphrodisiacs, oysters, wine mixed with herbs, even pulverized gemstones thought to enhance virility. Everyone had a role to play. Picture Catherine of Aragon, in 1510, pregnant for the first time. The entire kingdom held its breath. Would she deliver the future of England? She gave birth to a son, who lived only 52 days. Then came miscarriage after miscarriage. 5 pregnancies. 1 surviving daughter. Henry watched other noble families around him facing the same nightmare. The Howards, the Seymours, the Boleyns. Every family fortune hung on the fragile hope of a living son. Marriage had become a desperate gamble with the highest stakes imaginable. Then came the procession. The couple would be led to the marital bed by this entire entourage of witnesses, sometimes a dozen or more people crowding into the bedchamber. A priest would bless the bed, sprinkling holy water and saying prayers for fertility. The witnesses didn't leave immediately. They arranged themselves around the room, curtains partially drawn for a semblance of privacy, but not so much that they couldn't testify later to what occurred. The number of witnesses depended on how wealthy the families were. In the great halls of Whitehall Palace, marriage contracts read like business mergers. Dowries were calculated down to the last gold coin. Jointures detailed provisions about widows' rights. Inheritance clauses that could span 20 pages. But the most crucial clause was always the same. What happens if there are no male heirs? Families hired lawyers, not matchmakers. They studied bloodlines like breeding charts. A marriage without the promise of legitimate sons was essentially worthless. Love was a luxury these families couldn't afford. What exactly did these witnesses verify? They needed to confirm the couple had been left alone in bed together, undressed. Some sources suggest they waited to hear sounds indicating consummation, though Tudor documentation stays delicate about details. For the highest-ranking marriages, witnesses might wait until the groom emerged to announce success. Sometimes they'd display the bloodied sheets as proof of the bride's virginity, a practice borrowed from medieval traditions. Physical evidence mattered more than privacy. Henry's desperation grew with each passing year. By 1525, he'd been married 16 years with only one living child, a daughter, Mary. Around him, other noble families whispered about the curse of the Tudors. Maybe Henry couldn't produce sons. Maybe God disapproved of his marriage to his brother's widow. The political implications were staggering. Without a male heir, Mary would inherit. A woman on the throne meant foreign princes circling like vultures, ready to claim England through marriage. Henry couldn't sleep. The kingdom's future depended on his virility. Imagine the psychological impact on these young couples, often teenagers in arranged marriages, meeting for the first time just days earlier. Letters from the 1560s describe brides paralyzed with terror, knowing their ability to perform this intimate act under scrutiny would determine their entire future. The groom faced equal pressure. Failure to consummate could lead to accusations of impotence, annulment, social humiliation. Their most private moment became the most public test of their union's validity. Some couples never recovered from this trauma. Enter Anne Boleyn in 1526. Dark eyes, sharp wit, and most importantly, the promise of sons. Henry had already noticed other wives producing male heirs for their husbands. Elizabeth Blount had given him a bastard son. If she could do it, surely Anne could provide legitimate heirs. The Boleyn family saw their opportunity and played it perfectly. They dangled the possibility of the one thing Henry needed most, a male heir wrapped in the legitimacy of holy matrimony. Anne wasn't just offering love, she was offering salvation. Salvation. The legal consequences were devastating when consummation couldn't be proven. In 1561, Lady Katherine Grey's marriage was declared invalid, partly because there were no witnesses to the bedding. Her children became illegitimate, removing them from succession. Exactly what Elizabeth wanted. The lack of witnesses became a convenient legal weapon. When Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Anne of Cleves, his claimed non-consummation was impossible to disprove because he'd dismissed the usual witnesses, claiming he wanted privacy. Suspicious timing. The marriage to Anne Boleyn in 1533 was supposed to solve everything. She was young, fertile, from good stock. Her sister Mary had already proven the Boleyn women could bear children for the king. Henry had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and torn apart centuries of religious tradition, all for the promise of legitimate sons. When Anne gave birth in September 1533, midwives prepared to announce a prince. Instead, out came another daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was so crushing, he couldn't even attend the christening. By 1536, Anne Boleyn had suffered multiple miscarriages, including what may have been a son. Henry's patience evaporated like morning mist. He'd sacrificed his international reputation, his first marriage, his relationship with Rome, all for sons that never came. Around court, whispers began. Maybe Anne was cursed. Maybe God was punishing Henry for his divorce. Other noble families watched in horror, knowing their own marriages hung on the same desperate thread. If the king himself couldn't secure legitimate male heirs, what hope did anyone have? Jane Seymour stepped into this breeding nightmare in 1536. Quiet, pale, seemingly fertile. The Seymour family had positioned her perfectly, modest enough to appear virtuous, young enough to bear multiple sons. Henry married her 11 days after Anne Boleyn's execution. No romantic courtship, no grand gestures, just the cold calculation of a man who needed heirs before time ran out. Jane's only job was to succeed where two previous wives had failed. Give Henry a son, or face the same fate as Anne. October 12, 1537. After 28 years of marriage and countless disappointments, Henry finally heard the words he'd dreamed of. Your Majesty, it's a son. Prince Edward's birth at Hampton Court Palace was celebrated with bonfires across England. Church bells rang for 3 days straight. Henry wept with relief. Jane Seymour had achieved what Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn could not. She'd secured the Tudor dynasty. For 12 days, Henry believed his nightmare was over. Then Jane died of childbed fever, leaving him with one precious, fragile son. One son wasn't enough. Henry knew the statistics. Infant mortality in Tudor England claimed nearly half of all children before age 5. Prince Edward was sickly from birth, pale and thin like his mother. Henry needed backup heirs, more sons to ensure the dynasty's survival. He married Anne of Cleves in 1540, but found her so unappealing, he never consummated the marriage. Then came Catherine Howard, young and fertile, but her indiscretions cost her head. Each failed marriage brought Henry closer to his worst fear, dying with only one surviving male heir, Catherine Parr, Henry's final wife, understood her role perfectly when she married him in 1543. She wasn't there for passion or companionship. At 31, she was a widow, experienced, potentially still fertile. Her job was to nurse the increasingly paranoid king and possibly provide additional sons. She managed to outlive Henry, but never gave him more children. When Henry died in 1547, the Great Quest had produced exactly one legitimate son, 9-year-old Edward, already showing signs of the illness that would kill him at 15. 28 years of marriage had barely secured anything. The noble families watching Henry's struggles learned harsh lessons. The Howards saw 2 of their daughters lose their heads for failing to produce sons. The Seymours gained a queen but lost her to childbirth after just 1 son. The Parrs survived by managing expectations. Marriage contracts became even more detailed, specifying exactly what happened if wives failed to produce male heirs within certain time frames. Families started negotiating divorce clauses before the wedding even occurred. Marriage had become a coldly calculated breeding program with life-or-death consequences. Edward VI's short reign from 1547 to 1553 proved Henry's worst fears justified. The boy king was intelligent but physically weak, coughing blood by age 13, without brothers as backup. Every cold became a constitutional crisis. Courtiers whispered about succession constantly. Would Edward marry and produce heirs before dying young? When tuberculosis finally claimed him at 15, the Tudor male line died with him. All of Henry's marriages, divorces, executions, and religious upheaval had bought the dynasty exactly 16 years of male rule. The irony was devastating. Mary Tudor's accession in 1553 represented everything Henry had tried to prevent. A woman on the throne, unmarried, already 37 years old. Her legitimacy was questionable. Henry had declared her illegitimate during his marriage to Anne Boleyn, but with no surviving males, England had no choice. Mary understood her precarious position. Her first priority wasn't religious reform or foreign policy. It was marriage. She needed a husband who could give her sons to secure Catholic succession. Philip II of Spain seemed perfect, until their marriage produced nothing but phantom pregnancies. Elizabeth II chose a different path entirely. Rather than risk the breeding game that had destroyed so many royal women, she remained unmarried. The Virgin Queen turned her unmarried state into a political weapon, dangling potential marriages before foreign princes, while never committing, but her choice meant the Tudor dynasty would die with her. No husband meant no heirs. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the throne passed to James VI of Scotland, a distant cousin. All of Henry's desperate scheming for male heirs had ultimately failed. The dynasty ended anyway. The Tudor obsession with male heirs reveals the brutal reality of royal marriage. These weren't love stories. They were breeding programs with crowns at stake. Women were valued only for their wombs. Men were measured by their ability to produce sons. The human cost was staggering: executions, miscarriages, broken hearts, and shattered lives. Yet in the end, Henry VIII's desperate quest for male heirs achieved nothing lasting. The dynasty died out anyway. The greatest irony: his most successful child was the daughter he never wanted, Elizabeth, who ruled for 45 glorious years. Chapter 4. Judgment in the Marriage Bed. Picture this. You're 16, maybe 17 years old. You met your spouse just 3 days ago at the altar ceremony. Now you're being undressed by strangers, led to a bed surrounded by witnesses who will judge whether you can perform under their watchful eyes. Your entire future, your family's fortune, your children's legitimacy, your own security, all depends on what happens in this terrifying hour. This was reality for Tudor nobles. Chapter 4. Tudor Marriage Contracts. Love or lawyers? Picture this. You're getting married, but first, teams of lawyers spend months crafting a document thicker than most novels. In Tudor England, marriage contracts weren't simple promises of love. They were intricate legal frameworks covering every possible scenario, from death to infertility to treason. These weren't romantic documents. They were business mergers disguised as wedding plans, protecting fortunes that could rival kingdoms. The witnesses weren't there for entertainment. They were legal insurance. Every person standing around that bed could later testify in court about what they saw, what they heard, if the marriage failed to produce heirs, if someone questioned the union's validity. These witnesses became crucial evidence. Their presence transformed the most intimate human moment into a legal proceeding. Young couples knew this perfectly well. The performance pressure was absolutely unbearable, knowing that failure meant annulment. shame, financial ruin. The average Tudor marriage contract ran 30 to 50 pages of dense legal Latin mixed with English. Families employed teams of specialist lawyers called conveyancers, men who spent their entire careers crafting these matrimonial agreements. The Paston family's 1477 contract took 8 months to negotiate, not because they were indecisive, but because every clause could determine whether future generations lived in castles or poorhouses. Love could wait, legal protection could not. Take Lady Katherine Grey in 1561. She married Edward Seymour in secret. No witnesses to their bedding ceremony. When the marriage was discovered, Elizabeth I's lawyers pounced on this detail. No witnesses meant no proof of consummation. The marriage was declared invalid. Their children became bastards. Catherine died in the Tower. Her crime wasn't treason. It was getting married without proper surveillance. The absence of witnesses became a weapon that destroyed an entire family line forever. Jointures were the most crucial element, the widow's insurance policy. If her husband died, the jointure guaranteed her annual income for life. Negotiating this required mathematical precision. Too little, and she'd face poverty. Too generous, and his heirs would challenge it in court. Lady Margaret Beaufort's jointure negotiations in 1473 involved calculating rents from 17 different properties across 3 counties. The math had to be perfect. Widowhood was expensive. Some families found creative ways around this humiliation. They'd conduct token beddings. Witnesses would ceremonially place the couple in bed together, then immediately withdraw. The couple's word about what happened next was accepted. This compromise satisfied legal requirements while preserving some dignity. Protestant reformers especially favoured this approach, arguing that forced observation of marital intimacy was an ungodly Catholic practice. But royal families, they still demanded full surveillance. Privacy was a luxury only commoners could afford in their marriages. Dowries moved in the opposite direction, wealth flowing from bride's family to grooms, but Tudor dowries weren't simple cash payments. They included livestock, household goods, jewellery, land rights, even debts that needed transferring. The 1501 marriage contract between Catherine of Aragon and Prince Arthur specified 200,000 crowns, but also listed every tapestry, every silver plate, every horse in her entourage. Nothing was too small to document. The psychological damage was immense. Letters from the period describe young brides weeping before their bedding ceremonies, grooms drinking themselves into stupors. Some couples never recovered from this trauma, their marriages forever haunted by that first night of public performance. Intimacy became associated with judgment, surveillance, failure. When you think about Tudor marriage problems, Henry VIII's 6 wives, the constant annulments, the desperate searches for heirs, remember that these unions began with the most private human act being turned into public theatre. The childlessness clauses reveal Tudor society's deepest fears. What happened if no heirs appeared? These sections read like legal prophecies, predicting every possible family disaster. If the wife proved barren, portions of her dowry might return to her family. If the husband died without children, his lands could revert to distant cousins. Some contracts even specified waiting periods, how long couples had to produce heirs before these provisions activated. The legal language was deliberately impenetrable to outsiders. Phrases like tendum et habendum and quosque filled pages, creating barriers only trained lawyers could navigate. This wasn't accidental. Families wanted contracts so complex that challenging them required expensive legal expertise. The Hard family's 1513 marriage agreement used 17 different Latin terms just to describe property ownership. Confusion was a feature, not a bug. Property transfers required the most intricate clauses. Lands came with histories, ancient rights, tenant obligations, shared boundaries with neighbouring estates. A single manor might involve dozens of legal precedents dating back centuries. The 1495 Stafford marriage contract dedicated 12 pages solely to describing the water rights attached to one mill. Every stream, every fishing weir, every seasonal flooding pattern had to be legally defined and transferred. Family negotiations resembled diplomatic summits more than wedding planning. Representatives from both houses would meet in neutral locations, often for weeks at a time. They brought account books, property surveys, genealogical charts proving bloodlines. The Nevilles and Percys spent 3 months in 1489 negotiating a single marriage contract, with breaks called when tempers flared over disputed inheritance claims. Marriage was warfare conducted through paperwork. Consider the 1503 contract between Edmund de la Pole and Margaret Scrope. The document specified that if Edmund was executed for treason, which happened 6 years later, Margaret would retain control of 3 specific manors, but forfeit the Yorkshire properties. The lawyers had actually predicted and planned for his political downfall. These weren't marriage contracts, they were comprehensive risk assessment documents covering every conceivable catastrophe. The lawyers themselves formed a specialized guild. Men like Thomas Pigott and William Roper made fortunes crafting these agreements, developing reputations for particular expertise. Pigott was known for his jointure calculations, Roper for his inheritance clauses. Families would travel across England to employ the right legal mind for their specific situation. The best matrimonial lawyers commanded fees equivalent to a yeoman's annual income. Regional variations added another layer of complexity. Welsh marriage law differed from English, Scottish contracts followed entirely different precedents. Families with properties spanning borders needed lawyers familiar with multiple legal systems. The 1507 Percy Douglas Agreement, involving lands in both England and Scotland, required consultation with legal experts from Edinburgh, York, and London. Cross-border marriages meant cross-border legal nightmares. Enforcement mechanisms were built into every contract. Penalty clauses specified exact financial consequences for breaking agreements. Shorties, wealthy friends who guaranteed compliance, risked their own fortunes if the marriage failed. The 1511 Courtroom contract named 16 shorties, each liable for 500 marks if either party withdrew. Marriage wasn't just binding the couple, it was binding entire networks of family and friends to ensure compliance. The social implications were staggering. Young people, often teenagers, found their entire futures predetermined by legal documents they couldn't read or understand. Lady Jane Grey discovered the terms of her marriage contract only days before her wedding, learning that her husband would inherit her claim to the throne. These contracts didn't just arrange marriages, they arranged destinies. Often without the bride and groom's knowledge or consent, the economic impact rippled through entire regions. A single marriage contract could determine which villages prospered, which tenant farmers kept their homes, which merchants received patronage. When the Howards married into the Fitzalarn family in 1513, the combined estates employed over 4,000 people. The marriage contract's property arrangements affected more livelihoods than most military campaigns. Wedding bells meant economic reshuffling on massive scales. Modern corporate merger documents pale beside Tudor marriage contracts. Today's business agreements cover financial assets and market share. Tudor contracts covered human lives across generations. They predicted wars, famines, political upheavals, personal tragedies. Every clause was a bet against an uncertain future. Contemporary lawyers might draft contracts for temporary business partnerships. Tudor lawyers drafted blueprints for dynastic survival spanning centuries. As you drift off tonight, consider how we've transformed marriage from legal transaction to personal choice. Tudor couples began their lives together bound by documents they'd never seen, crafted by lawyers they'd never met, protecting interests they'd never understand. The most intimate human relationship was mediated through the most impersonal legal language. Sometimes the greatest freedom is simply choosing who to love, without requiring a team of lawyers to make it official. Chapter 5. Repercussions and Revolution. When you strip away the pageantry and protocol, the bedding ceremony reveals something stark about Tudor marriage. This wasn't about love or even attraction. It was a property transaction with bodies as collateral. The witnesses weren't there to celebrate intimacy. They were there to verify a business deal. 2 families exchanging assets, with the couple's most private moment serving as the final signature on an invisible contract. Chapter 5. Under the Coverture. Women in Tudor England. Imagine waking up one morning to discover you no longer exist, not physically, but legally. Your name belongs to someone else now. Your property, gone. Your debts, erased. But so are your rights to make any decisions about your own life. This wasn't a nightmare for Tudor women, it was marriage. The moment they said "I do," the law performed a kind of magic trick. The woman simply disappeared. Think about the psychological weight of that reality. You're 15, maybe 16 years old. You've known your spouse for perhaps 3 days, and now, with a dozen strangers watching from the shadows, you must perform the most intimate act of human connection. Not for pleasure, not for love, but to satisfy lawyers and protect inheritances. How do you recover from that? How do you ever separate intimacy from obligation? They called it coverture, from the old French meaning to cover, like a blanket thrown over a woman's entire existence. Under this legal doctrine, A married woman became what lawyers termed femme covert, a covered woman. Her legal identity merged completely with her husband's. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, or sue anyone in court. In the eyes of the law, she had become nothing more than an extension of her husband's will. Some couples never did recover. Court records hint at marriages that remained cold for decades, where that first night of enforced intimacy poisoned everything that followed. Others found ways to reclaim their connection, building genuine affection despite the humiliating beginning. But imagine the strength that required learning to be vulnerable with someone when your first shared vulnerability had been performed for an audience of witnesses and bureaucrats. The transformation happened instantly at the altar. One moment she was a person with rights, however limited. The next she was legally invisible. Her father's property, now her husband's, any income she might earn, his. Even her clothes, her jewelry, her personal possessions, they all belonged to him now. If she committed a crime, her husband could be held responsible. The law assumed she was acting under his direction. She had no separate legal will. The practice began to fade in the early 1600s, just as something new was emerging in England. The radical idea that marriage might actually be about companionship, that husbands and wives might choose each other for affection, not just alliance. Protestant reformers started arguing that love between spouses was actually godly, not just convenient. Privacy became precious. Intimacy became, well, intimate. But here's what's fascinating. Within this system that stripped women of almost everything, there was one powerful exception, one legal loophole that terrified husbands and their families. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled, completely, erased as if it never happened. All those property transfers, void. The dowry, returned. The carefully negotiated alliance between families, dissolved. This exception gave women a weapon nobody expected them to have, the power to unmake their own erasure. By the 1700s, the bedding ceremony had largely disappeared from even royal weddings. The shift wasn't sudden, it was gradual, generational. Parents who had endured witnessed consummation decided their children deserved better. The rise of romantic ideals in literature reflected what was already changing in bedchambers across England. Marriage was slowly transforming from merger to partnership. Think about the cruel irony here. A woman lost everything when she married, except the right to claim the marriage never really happened. If her husband couldn't or wouldn't consummate the union, she could petition for annulment. Church courts would listen, they would investigate, and if they agreed, she could reclaim her legal existence. Her property would return to her family. She would be unmarried again, with all the limited rights that status provided. It was a narrow escape route, but it was real. Tonight, as you drift off in the privacy of your own space, consider this luxury that Tudor couples never knew. Your bedroom is yours alone. Your intimate moments belong only to you and whoever you choose to share them with. No witnesses required, no verification needed. That privacy we take for granted. It's a revolution that took centuries to win. This is why the bedding ceremony existed. Not just tradition or medieval barbarism, it was legal insurance. Families with fortunes at stake needed proof that consummation had occurred. Without witnesses, without evidence, a wife could later claim the marriage was never valid. She could argue her husband was impotent, or that he had refused to fulfill his marital duties. The witnesses weren't there for entertainment. They were there to protect massive financial investments from this one remaining female power. The law books of the 1500s spell it out clearly. A married woman was legally suspended during marriage. She existed, but in a state of legal limbo, unable to act independently. William Blackstone would later describe it as two people becoming one, and that one person was the husband. But the annulment clause created a terrifying possibility for families. What if their daughter-in-law decided to use this power? What if she claimed non-consummation years later? The entire marriage contract could crumble. Some women did use this power strategically. Catherine of Aragon insisted for years that her marriage to Henry's brother Arthur had never been consummated, making her marriage to Henry valid. Anne of Cleves accepted Henry's annulment, partly because non-consummation meant she could keep her generous settlement and remain unmarried. These women understood that in a system designed to erase them, their bodies were their only remaining legal territory, their only leverage in a world that had stripped away everything else. For most women, though, coverture meant practical invisibility. They couldn't defend themselves in court if accused of wrongdoing. They couldn't pursue debts owed to them. They couldn't write wills without their husband's permission. If their husband died in debt, creditors could seize everything, including her personal belongings from before marriage. The legal system treated her like a permanent child, incapable of making binding decisions. Her husband wasn't just her partner, he was her legal guardian. Even her children weren't really hers under Coverture. Her husband had complete legal authority over them. He could decide their education, their marriages, their futures. If the couple separated, he kept the children. She had no legal claim to custody. Motherhood didn't grant her any additional rights. It was just another function performed under her husband's legal identity. The emotional bonds meant nothing to the law. Only his authority mattered in deciding their fate. The irony gets deeper when you realize that single women, spinsters and widows, had significantly more legal rights than married women. A widow could own property, make contracts, run businesses. She had reclaimed her legal existence through her husband's death. Some wealthy widows deliberately chose not to remarry, understanding that marriage would mean surrendering their hard-won independence. They had tasted legal personhood and weren't willing to give it up again for romantic attachment. But the threat of annulment created strange power dynamics within marriages. A husband who mistreated his wife risked her claiming non-consummation, especially in the early years of marriage. Some women used this as leverage for better treatment, more independence, or greater say in household decisions. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack in the system where a woman's word could still carry legal weight if she was brave enough to use it. The church's role in all this was complex. Canon law recognized women's spiritual equality, but civil law treated them as property. Church courts would hear annulment cases, sometimes ruling in women's favor. This created tension between religious and secular authorities. The church needed marriages to be valid sacraments, but civil society needed them to be binding property contracts. Women sometimes played these competing interests against each other, seeking justice through religious courts when civil courts failed them. Records from Tudor England show us women finding creative ways to work around coverture's restrictions. They formed secret business partnerships through male relatives. They hid assets in trust arrangements before marriage. They used informal networks to lend money and maintain influence. The system was designed to erase them, but they found ways to cast shadows, to leave traces, to maintain some threads of independent existence. They survived by becoming experts at working within impossible constraints. What's haunting is how completely this system normalized female erasure. Legal textbooks discussed coverture matter-of-factly, as if women's disappearance was natural law rather than human choice. Society accepted that marriage necessarily meant the death of female legal identity. Even women themselves often internalized these limitations, seeing them as God's will rather than man's invention. The system was so complete that many couldn't imagine alternatives, couldn't envision a world where marriage didn't require legal suicide. Tonight, as you rest in a world where your legal identity survives marriage, remember these women who lived under the cover of their husbands' names. They found power in the only place the system left them, in their ability to say this marriage never happened. In a legal landscape designed to erase them completely, they held on to this one remaining thread of agency. Small comfort, but sometimes small comforts are how we survive systems designed to break us. Chapter 6. Bedding Ceremony. The ins and outs. The wedding feast has ended, the dancing is done, but for Tudor nobles, the most crucial part of the evening is just beginning. What happens next isn't romance, it's a carefully choreographed legal proceeding. The bedding ceremony follows ancient protocols, each step designed to ensure one thing: undeniable proof that this marriage has been properly consummated. Privacy. The protocol begins with separation. The bride is whisked away by her female attendants, sisters, cousins, perhaps her new mother-in-law. They lead her to a private chamber, where the real preparation begins. This isn't about beauty or romance. It's about creating the right conditions for what must happen next. Every piece of jewelry is removed. Every elaborate layer of wedding finery must come off. What remains will be carefully chosen for very specific reasons. Meanwhile, the groom faces his own ritual. His male companions, brothers, friends, sometimes his father, escort him to another chamber. The atmosphere here is different, louder, cruder. These men know what's coming, and they're trying to ease the tension with ribald jokes and advice that would make modern audiences blush. But beneath the bravado, everyone understands the gravity. This young man's performance tonight will be scrutinized by witnesses and potentially questioned in court. The bride's attendants select her shift with extraordinary care. This isn't any nightgown, it's a specific garment designed for this moment. Made of fine linen, thin enough to be removed easily, but modest enough to satisfy propriety. The neckline can't be too low, The hem can't be too short. Yet it must be accessible, designed so that consummation can occur without complete removal. Every detail has been debated by mothers and aunts who've witnessed these ceremonies before. The men prepare their own version of this costume. The groom's nightshirt is equally calculated, long enough for modesty, loose enough for function. But first, they offer him liquid courage, wine mixed with herbs, thought to enhance virility, oysters, exotic spices, sometimes even pulverized gemstones dissolved in ale. These supposed aphrodisiacs are taken seriously. Nobody wants to risk failure when so many fortunes hang in the balance. The bride's preparation includes its own strange rituals. Her hair is brushed loose, virgin hair falling free for the last time. Some attendants whisper advice about what to expect, though often these young women know little themselves. Others offer their own version of liquid courage, watered wine, herbal teas meant to calm nerves. The bride might be 15, 16, barely understanding what's about to happen to her, under the watchful eyes of strangers. Now comes the convergence. Both parties, dressed in their carefully chosen nightclothes, are led toward the marital chamber. The procession feels almost ceremonial, because that's exactly what it is. Candles light the way, sometimes musicians play, but there's an undercurrent of tension that music can't quite mask. Everyone knows what's about to happen. Everyone knows they'll be required to watch, or at least to witness the beginning. The bedchamber itself has been prepared like a stage. The bed linens are fresh, often specially blessed. Holy water has been sprinkled, prayers have been said, but this isn't about creating a romantic atmosphere. It's about establishing the proper religious and legal framework. The witnesses, sometimes a dozen or more, arrange themselves around the room, close enough to see, close enough to testify later if necessary. A priest performs the final blessing. He sprinkles more holy water on the bed itself, invoking fertility and divine protection. This religious element isn't decorative, it's legally required. A marriage consummated without proper religious oversight could be challenged later. The priest's presence legitimizes what's about to happen, transforming what might otherwise be seen as mere physical coupling into a sacramental act blessed by God himself. The couple is formally presented to the bed, not led presented, like offerings at an altar. The witnesses watch as they climb beneath the covers, still wearing their shifts and nightshirts. Curtains might be drawn partially, but never completely. The witnesses must be able to confirm that both parties are present, undressed appropriately, and alone together in the marriage bed. Privacy is a luxury that comes after legal requirements are satisfied. What happens next varies by family tradition and rank. For the highest nobility, witnesses might remain in the chamber, seated quietly in chairs arranged around the bed. Lower-ranking families might allow the witnesses to wait outside the door, but they don't leave entirely. They listen for sounds. They wait for confirmation. Some accounts describe witnesses actually timing the encounter, ensuring it lasts long enough to constitute genuine consummation. The psychological pressure on these young people is almost unimaginable. The bride, often a teenager, must perform intimacy while knowing strangers are listening, waiting, judging. The groom faces equal terror. Failure to consummate could lead to annulment, disgrace, even accusations of impotence. Some contemporary accounts describe brides weeping throughout the encounter. Others mention grooms requiring multiple attempts over several nights before witnesses could confirm success. When consummation is complete, the groom must emerge and announce success to the waiting witnesses. Some traditions require him to display the bloodied sheets as proof of his bride's virginity and the marriage's completion. The witnesses examine these sheets, sometimes by candlelight, looking for stains that prove penetration occurred. These linens might be preserved as evidence, legal documentation of the marriage's validity, in case of future disputes. The witnesses then record their testimony. Not in writing necessarily, but they commit details to memory. They note the time, the circumstances, what they heard or saw. This testimony might be called upon years later if the marriage's validity is questioned, if heirs are disputed, if property transfers are challenged. These people aren't voyeurs. They're unwilling participants in a legal proceeding that happens to involve naked teenagers and marital consummation. Some couples found ways to subvert the system. Token beddings where witnesses confirmed the couple was placed in bed together, then immediately left, trusting their word about what followed. But this was risky. Without proper witnesses, the marriage could be declared invalid later, exactly what happened to Lady Katherine Grey when her secret marriage was discovered. The lack of bedding witnesses became the legal weapon used to bastardize her children. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, some Protestant voices were calling the bedding ceremony an unseemly Catholic holdover with no biblical basis. But tradition dies hard when property and power are at stake. The practice persisted in royal circles well into the next century, a reminder that for the nobility, marriage was never about love, it was about creating legal heirs under circumstances that no court could later question or invalidate. The bedchamber fell silent as Father Thomas entered, holy water glinting in his silver vessel. This final ritual before consummation held more weight than the wedding ceremony itself. Every noble family understood that God's blessing upon the marital bed could mean the difference between a dynasty that thrived for centuries and one that died with the current generation. The priest's hands trembled slightly. Even he understood what hung in the balance tonight. The witnesses arranged themselves with military precision around the four-poster bed. Each position had been debated for days beforehand. Too close, and they might interfere with the sacred moment. Too far, and they couldn't fulfill their legal obligations. Lady Margaret positioned herself near the window, while Lord Essex took his place by the door. Everyone knew their testimony might be scrutinized in court decades later if succession was ever questioned. Princess Mary Tudor's wedding night in 1514 resembled a small parliament session more than an intimate moment. 47 witnesses crowded into the royal bedchamber, representing both English and French interests. Ambassadors, ladies-in-waiting, bishops and courtiers, all crammed into a space meant for two people. The young princess, just 18, had never imagined her most private moment would become England's most public spectacle. But royal marriages demanded royal witnesses. Father Thomas raised his voice above the shuffling crowd. Blessed be this bed, prepared for the joining of man and wife in holy matrimony. His Latin prayers echoed off stone walls as he sprinkled consecrated water over silk covers. Each droplet carried the weight of centuries of Catholic tradition. The blessing wasn't just for the couple, it was for the children they would create, the bloodline they would continue, the kingdom they might rule. The number of witnesses revealed everything about a family's status. Minor nobility might have 6 observers, landed gentry perhaps 12. But when the Howards married into royalty, 30 witnesses filled the chamber. Each additional pair of eyes represented political influence, legal protection, and social standing. The bride's father had fought for months to secure the right number of observers. Too few witnesses meant insufficient proof. Too many meant humiliation. Grant unto these thy servants the gift of fertility. The priest continued, his voice growing stronger with each sacred word. Medieval theology taught that God personally blessed each conception, and that earthly witnesses helped ensure heaven's attention. The holy water fell on pillows where future earls might be conceived, on sheets where the next generation of England's ruling class would begin their existence. Nothing about this moment was left to chance or privacy. Lady Katherine positioned herself behind the carved oak headboard, while Sir William took his place near the fireplace. The strategic placement wasn't random. Each witness needed clear sightlines to the bed, without creating an atmosphere of voyeurism. Years of legal precedent had established the proper distance, the appropriate angles, the correct number of candles, even the shadows had been planned. Everything was choreographed to protect the couple's dignity while ensuring undeniable testimony. The priest's blessing extended beyond the couple to encompass the very room where they would begin their married life. Holy water touched door frames to prevent evil spirits, window sills to invite God's light, and floor stones to sanctify their first steps as husband and wife. This wasn't superstition, it was legal necessity. Church law required proper blessing of the marital chamber. Without it, enemies could later claim the marriage lacked divine sanction, opening doors for annulment. May this union bring forth sons to carry forward the family name, Father Thomas intoned, his words heavy with political meaning. The prayer for male heirs wasn't just religious hope, it was economic survival. Daughters inherited only in the absence of sons, and complicated inheritance laws could scatter family wealth across multiple bloodlines. The witnesses murmured their agreement, knowing that everyone's financial future depended on the couple's ability to produce the right kind of children. The solemnity of the moment struck everyone present. This wasn't titillation or entertainment. It was the final act in a legal drama that had been building for months. Marriage contracts worth thousands of pounds hung in the balance, dowries, jointures, property transfers, and political alliances all waited for consummation to make them binding. The young couple bore the weight of their entire family's ambitions. Love was irrelevant, legacy was everything. Each witness understood their solemn responsibility. They weren't just observers, they were legal protectors of both families' interests. Their testimony would need to be precise, unshakable, and sworn under oath. if the marriage was ever challenged. Lord Essex had already mentally prepared his statement about the proper blessing, the couple's willing participation, and their suitable preparation for consummation. His words might determine the legitimacy of future children, the validity of inheritance claims. Royal beddings required bishops, while noble marriages needed only parish priests. The higher the rank, the more elaborate the blessing ceremony. Princess Mary's bedding included 3 bishops, 2 abbots, and a papal representative. Each religious figure added weight to the sacred ritual, making annulment nearly impossible. The French ambassadors particularly wanted multiple clergy present. Their king's marriage to the English princess needed unquestionable validity to secure the political alliance between their nations. The bed itself had been prepared according to ancient traditions, fresh rushes scattered across the floor, newly blessed sheets imported from Flanders, pillows stuffed with swan down and sprinkled with herbs believed to encourage conception. Even the curtains had been chosen for their symbolic meaning, red for passion, blue for fidelity, gold for prosperity. Nothing was coincidental. Every detail reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom about ensuring successful marriages and legitimate heirs. Father Thomas concluded his prayers with a final blessing over the couple themselves. May God grant you fruitful union and protect your offspring through generations to come. The formal religious ceremony was ending, but the legal requirements were just beginning. Soon, the witnesses would step back behind drawn curtains, close enough to hear, far enough to preserve minimal dignity. The young bride's hands trembled as she realized the moment of public scrutiny was finally arriving. The witnesses retreated to their designated positions behind partially drawn curtains as the priest departed. They would remain until they could testify that consummation had occurred, listening for sounds, waiting for the groom's eventual emergence, prepared to swear under oath about what they observed. The couple was finally alone, but not really. 40 ears still strained to hear confirmation that this marriage had become legally binding through physical union. In the morning, the witnesses would disperse to their homes, carrying with them the legal proof of a properly consummated marriage. Their testimony would be recorded in family documents, church records, and court archives. Some would carry this knowledge for decades, waiting for the day when disputed inheritance or questioned legitimacy brought them before judges to swear about what they witnessed on this night. The blessing was complete. The marriage was legal. The dynasty was secure. Chapter 8. Witnessing. What and how? Here's the thing about Tudor bedding ceremonies that makes your skin crawl. The witnesses weren't just standing around for show. They had specific instructions about what to observe, what to listen for, what to remember. Because if a marriage could be annulled for non-consummation, then someone better be able to swear under oath that consummation actually happened. The pressure was unimaginable. Picture this scene from 1547. The bride, maybe 16, has been undressed by her aunts and elder sisters. They've examined her shift, the thin linen gown that's supposed to be modest but accessible. Meanwhile, the groom's male relatives are giving him wine mixed with crushed oyster shells. Everyone believes this will help him perform. The bedroom door is about to open to a small crowd of very important people. The witnesses weren't random guests. They were carefully chosen, trusted family members, clergymen, sometimes legal representatives. For royal marriages, we're talking about a dozen or more people. When Princess Mary Tudor married the French king in 1514, courtiers lined the walls. Each person there could later be called to testify in church courts if the marriage's validity was ever questioned. Legal insurance, essentially. What exactly were they witnessing? First, that the couple was placed in bed together, both in their shifts, with no clothing barriers. The curtains might be drawn partially, not for complete privacy, but so the witnesses could still hear what happened next. Some accounts mention listening for specific sounds, the rustle of linen, certain breathing patterns, muffled conversations. It sounds invasive because it absolutely was. The waiting period could last hours. Witnesses would arrange themselves around the bedchamber, some sitting on chests or benches, others standing near windows. Servants might bring wine or small foods. This wasn't a quick ritual, it was an extended vigil until the groom emerged to announce success. Imagine the psychological pressure on 2 teenagers who'd probably met 3 days earlier during the wedding negotiations. Here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. In some cases, particularly high-ranking marriages, the groom was expected to display the bloodied sheets as proof of his bride's virginity and successful consummation. The witnesses would examine these, making note of stains, their location, their authenticity. This evidence could be referenced decades later if inheritance disputes arose. The bride's most private moment became public record. But what if nothing happened? What if the groom couldn't perform under such pressure? The witnesses were trained to note everything: how long the couple remained in bed, whether the groom emerged at all, his demeanor when he did. Failure to consummate wasn't just embarrassing. It could invalidate the entire marriage, returning dowries, cancelling property transfers, destroying political alliances. Some couples found workarounds. Letters from the 1560s described courtesy beddings, where witnesses confirmed the couple was properly placed in bed, then immediately withdrew. The families trusted the couple's word about what followed. This was more common among Protestant nobles who considered the full ritual a Catholic superstition. But royal marriages, those still required the complete humiliating ceremony. The legal consequences of improper witnessing were severe. When Lady Katherine Grey married secretly in 1561 without bedding witnesses, Elizabeth I used this as grounds to declare the marriage invalid. Their children were bastardized, removed from succession. The absence of witnesses became a convenient weapon. Every noble family learned this lesson. Proper documentation of consummation was essential for legitimacy. Henry VIII actually manipulated this system when he wanted to annul his marriage to Anne of Cleves. He claimed non-consummation, and since he'd dismissed the usual witnesses claiming he wanted privacy, there was no one to contradict him. The lack of proper witnesses made his lie legally unassailable. The system designed to protect marriage legitimacy became a tool for destroying it. Witnesses had to be prepared to testify years later. Church courts would summon them to describe exactly what they'd observed, the couple's behavior, the timing, any statements made. Some witnesses kept written records of what they'd seen and heard. Imagine being asked 20 years later to recall the intimate details of someone's wedding night. Yet this testimony could determine inheritance rights for entire estates. The psychological trauma was immense. Letters from Elizabeth Talbot describe her daughter's terror before her 1559 wedding night, knowing her future depended on performing this most private act while others listened. Some brides were given herbal preparations to calm their nerves. Grooms received different treatments, substances supposed to enhance performance. The pressure to succeed publicly in such an intimate moment broke many couples before they'd properly begun. Not all witnesses were comfortable with their role. Some accounts describe clergymen blessing the bed, then positioning themselves as far from the couple as possible, facing away. Others mention female witnesses weeping during the ceremony, understanding the humiliation they were inflicting. But they stayed anyway, because the legal protection of proper witnessing outweighed personal discomfort. Duty trumped compassion. Common people experienced this differently. Peasant weddings might include friends escorting the couple to their chamber with music and celebration, but actual witnessing was rare. The legal stakes weren't high enough to justify the intrusion. This humiliation was reserved for those whose marriages involved significant property, titles, or political alliances. Poverty, ironically, meant privacy. By the late 1500s, some voices began questioning the practice. Protestant reformers argued that bedding ceremonies had no biblical basis, calling them unseemly Catholic holdovers. These criticisms grew during Elizabeth's reign, though royal circles maintained the tradition well into the 1600s. Change came slowly. Privacy and romance only became valued when marriage began shifting from purely economic to partially emotional institutions. As you drift off tonight, be grateful for the privacy we take for granted in our most intimate moments. Tudor couples' wedding nights weren't the beginning of their private life together. They were the most public verification of their union's validity. The witnesses stayed not from curiosity, but necessity in a world where legitimacy meant everything, and a woman's word meant nothing. Chapter 9. Bloodied Sheets. Proof of Purity. Mourning would bring the most humiliating display of all. While Tudor couples endured witnesses during their bedding ceremony, what happened afterward was perhaps even more invasive. The blood-stained sheets weren't discreetly disposed of, they became evidence, public proof that the marriage had been properly consummated, and that the bride had been pure. This tradition reached back centuries, rooted in biblical customs and medieval law. The morning after the wedding, female attendants would carefully inspect the bedding. They looked for specific stains on the white linen sheets, evidence of the bride's broken hymen. These women, often elderly relatives or trusted servants, had been through this process themselves decades earlier. They knew exactly what constituted acceptable proof. The inspection wasn't casual, it was methodical, documented, and often witnessed by multiple people from both families. Once verified, the stained sheets might be displayed to family members, sometimes even hung from windows for the community to see. This wasn't considered scandalous, It was celebration, a public announcement that the marriage was valid, the bride had been virtuous, and the union could produce legitimate heirs. In some noble households, the sheets were preserved as legal documents, tucked away with marriage contracts and property deeds as proof of consummation. But what happened when there was no blood? The consequences could be devastating. A bride might face accusations of lost virtue. Even if the absence of bleeding had natural explanations, young women could have their hymens torn through horseback riding, dancing, or physical labor. Some women simply didn't bleed during first intercourse. Medical knowledge of the time couldn't distinguish between these possibilities and assumed unchastity. Desperate brides developed strategies to ensure bloodied sheets. Some pricked their fingers with pins, dotting the linen with their own blood before the wedding night. Others used sheep's blood obtained from kitchen servants. Older women sometimes advised nervous brides to use red wine or berry juice as backup. These deceptions were risky. Discovery could lead to annulment, disgrace, or worse. But the alternative seemed more terrifying. The pressure extended beyond the wedding night itself. Mothers spent years preparing daughters for this moment, explaining what was expected and feared. Girls grew up knowing their worth would be measured by stains on fabric. They understood that their entire future, their security, their family's honor, their children's legitimacy, could depend on their body producing the right evidence at the right time. Grooms faced their own version of this scrutiny. If no blood appeared, suspicions might fall on the husband's ability to properly consummate the marriage. Was he too gentle, too inexperienced, impotent? These questions could haunt a man's reputation for years. Some grooms were coached by older male relatives on techniques to ensure the necessary evidence appeared. Advice that sounds brutal by today's standards. The bloodied sheet tradition wasn't unique to England. Across Europe, similar customs persisted into the 17th and 18th centuries. In France, royal beddings included formal inspections by court physicians. Spanish noble families employed professional witnesses, whose only job was verifying consummation evidence. These practices were considered so normal that questioning them seemed absurd, like doubting the necessity of marriage contracts themselves. Religious authorities blessed these inspections, citing biblical precedents. The Book of Deuteronomy specifically mentions bringing forth evidence of a bride's virginity before the elders. Medieval church scholars interpreted these passages as divine endorsement of the bloodied sheet tradition. Priests sometimes participated in the morning inspections, adding spiritual authority to what was already considered legal necessity. God's law and man's law aligned perfectly at women's expense. Court records reveal numerous marriage disputes centered on bloodied sheets. Families sued each other over insufficient evidence, claiming fraud or deception. Lawyers specialized in these cases, developing arguments about what constituted valid proof. Some trials lasted months, with witnesses testifying about blood patterns, fabric types, and timing. The intimate details of wedding nights became public court testimony, preserved in legal documents for posterity. As medical knowledge slowly advanced, some physicians began questioning the bloodied sheet tradition. By the late 1600s, a few brave doctors published treatises explaining that hymen integrity wasn't reliable proof of virginity. They faced fierce resistance from traditionalists who saw such ideas as dangerous attacks on marriage itself. These early medical voices represented the beginning of change, but that change would take centuries. The emotional toll on young brides cannot be overstated. Letters and diaries from the period reveal profound anxiety, shame, and trauma associated with wedding nights. Women wrote of sleepless nights before marriage, fearing they couldn't produce the required proof. Some developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. The fear of discovery, of failing this most basic test of worth, haunted their most intimate moments. Interestingly, lower-class couples rarely endured these inspections. Peasant marriages weren't legally complex enough to require such verification. The bloodied sheet tradition was primarily a burden of wealth and status. Poor women might have envied noble brides' material advantages, but those advantages came with humiliations that common women were spared. Sometimes poverty offered unexpected forms of dignity and privacy. The tradition began fading during the Enlightenment, as ideas about individual privacy and personal autonomy slowly gained acceptance. Romantic love started becoming valued in marriage, making public verification of intimacy seem increasingly barbaric. But change was gradual. Some noble families continued bloodied sheet inspections into the early 1800s. Old traditions died hard, especially when property and inheritance remained at stake. Modern readers might wonder how such practices could have been normalized. But remember, these weren't seen as cruel or unusual at the time. They were considered necessary protections for families and society. Women's bodies were viewed as vessels for legitimate heirs, not as belonging to the women themselves. Privacy, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for matters affecting family honor and legal inheritance. Tonight, as you settle into your own private space, remember those Tudor brides who knew no such luxury. Their most intimate moments were scrutinized, documented, and displayed as proof of worth. The bloodied sheet tradition reminds us how recently women's sexuality has been their own. Sleep peacefully, knowing your bedroom truly belongs to you, a privacy that countless women before us never knew. Chapter 10. The Nightmare of a Tudor Wedding Night. Picture yourself at 16, meeting your husband for the first time 3 days before your wedding. Now imagine that on your wedding night, a dozen strangers will stand in your bedchamber, watching, waiting to verify that you've successfully consummated your marriage. For Tudor brides, this wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday, and the psychological scars lasted lifetimes. The dread began weeks before the actual ceremony. Young brides like Elizabeth Talbot would lie awake at night, knowing their most intimate moment would become a public performance. Letters from the era reveal sleepless nights, refusal to eat, and what we'd now recognize as panic attacks. One bride wrote to her sister, "I cannot bear the thought of their eyes upon me, when I know so little of what's expected." Elizabeth Talbot's correspondence from 1567 gives us the clearest window into this psychological torture. Writing to her mother days before her wedding, she confessed, "I wake each morning with such terror in my breast that I can scarce breathe. Mother, what if I cannot? What if my body betrays me before all those watching faces?" Her handwriting grew shakier with each letter. The paper itself bears witness to her trembling. The preparation ritual was designed to maximize humiliation. Older women would examine the bride's body beforehand, checking for any impediments to consummation. They'd instruct her on positions, timing, even the sounds she should make to prove her defloration. Young Elizabeth wrote, "They speak of my body as if it were a mare being prepared for breeding. I am not permitted even shame in private." The grooms faced their own psychological torment. Expected to perform on command while strangers watched, many young men turned to excessive drink or herbal remedies that often made matters worse. Court records reveal cases of impotence blamed on the pressure of public consummation. One 20-year-old duke confessed in his diary, "How can a man prove his manhood when trembling like a child before his tutors? The moment witnesses entered the bedchamber, childhood ended forever." Aunts, uncles, family priests, legal representatives, sometimes 15 or more adults, crowding into what should have been a sanctuary. They'd arranged themselves along the walls like judges in a courtroom. Elizabeth described it perfectly. "I felt like a criminal awaiting execution, except my crime was being born female and marriageable." The bedchamber itself became a theatre of cruelty. Candles were positioned to provide adequate lighting for observation. The bed curtains, partially drawn for modesty, but never fully closed. Fresh linens were laid specifically to show evidence of defloration afterward. Every detail calculated to transform the most private human experience into legal documentation. Romance had no place in this ceremony of verification and property transfer. Elizabeth's letters reveal the specific terrors that haunted Tudor brides. "What if I cry out? What if I cannot stop crying? What if my body refuses him, and the witnesses declare our union invalid?" She worried about everything from her appearance unclothed to whether her fear would prevent consummation entirely. Each concern was valid, because failure meant annulment, disgrace, and economic ruin for her entire family. Most devastating was the reality that these young couples barely knew each other. Arranged marriages often brought together teenagers who'd shared perhaps a dozen supervised conversations. Now they were expected to perform the most intimate act, while strangers watched. One bride wrote, "He is kind enough, but I know his favorite foods better than his touch. How can I love a stranger before witnesses?" The performance anxiety was crushing. Witnesses expected to see specific evidence, blood on the sheets, sounds of consummation, the bride's tears of defloration. If these signs weren't clear enough, the marriage could be questioned years later. Young couples learned to manufacture the expected responses. Elizabeth confessed, "We rehearse our own humiliation, practicing sounds and movements like actors in the world's cruelest play." Before the bedding ceremony, physicians would examine the bride's body for what they called impediments to marital duty. This physical inspection by strangers was traumatic enough, but the results were shared with the groom's family. If any abnormality was discovered, the engagement could be broken immediately. Elizabeth wrote, "They examined me like livestock at market, noting every imperfection for their ledgers. The waiting was perhaps the worst part. Witnesses would remain in the chamber until they heard sufficient evidence of consummation, which could take hours. Some couples, paralyzed by fear, simply lay frozen until dawn. Others would whisper desperate strategies to each other, while pretending to make love. The pressure to perform created a psychological prison that many couples never escaped, even in later private moments. When consummation failed, the consequences were swift and brutal. The marriage was declared invalid, dowries were returned, and both families faced social disgrace. The bride often became unmarriageable, blamed for the failure regardless of cause. Elizabeth witnessed this happen to her cousin. Poor Margaret sits in her father's house like a ghost, neither maid nor wife, condemned to spinsterhood at 17 because her body betrayed her before witnesses. The psychological damage lasted decades. Many Tudor couples never developed healthy intimacy after such traumatic beginnings. They'd associate physical love with public shame, performance anxiety, and legal scrutiny. Divorce wasn't an option, so they lived as strangers sharing a name. Elizabeth's later letters reveal a marriage marked by duty rather than affection, the bedding ceremony's true legacy, written in emotional scars. Some couples developed coping strategies that bordered on the heroic. They'd create their own private wedding ceremony later, stealing moments of genuine intimacy away from family supervision. Others turned to trusted servants who would provide false testimony about successful consummation, protecting couples who needed more time to adjust to each other. These small rebellions were acts of self-preservation in a system designed to crush individual desire. As you drift off tonight, imagine trying to sleep knowing that tomorrow, the most intimate moment of your life will be witnessed and judged by strangers. For Tudor brides like Elizabeth Talbot, this wasn't imagination, it was reality. Their letters remind us that behind every historical practice lay real people, with real fears, real tears, and real trauma that echoed through generations. Chapter 11. Grooms under the hammer. Failure to perform. For all the scrutiny placed on brides, Tudor grooms faced their own terrifying pressure. Imagine being a 17-year-old nobleman, expected to perform intimately while knowing that failure meant more than embarrassment. It meant legal annulment, social destruction, the end of carefully negotiated alliances between powerful families. Your inability to consummate wouldn't just humiliate you, it could destroy your family's political future entirely. The physical pressure was crushing. Young men were often given supposed aphrodisiacs before the bedding ceremony: oysters, wine mixed with ground pearls, even pulverized horn from exotic animals. Their male companions would offer crude advice, share exaggerated stories of their own prowess. But beneath the bravado, everyone knew the stakes. This wasn't about pleasure or even procreation. This was about proving legal competency. One failure could invalidate everything. The witnesses made everything worse. A dozen courtiers surrounding the marriage bed, waiting to confirm consummation had occurred. Some grooms reported feeling watched, even with curtains partially drawn. The sounds they made, the time they spent, even their exit from the bedchamber, all of it scrutinized by men who would later testify in court if the marriage's validity was questioned. Privacy was a luxury they couldn't afford. Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, married Mary Howard in 1533 when both were barely 15. Contemporary letters describe his panic the night before the ceremony. His father's reputation for annulling marriages hung over him. One witness recorded him vomiting from nervousness, hours before the bedding. The marriage was never consummated. Fitzroy died 3 years later, still technically a virgin husband. The shame haunted the Howard family for decades. Impotence accusations were devastating because they were nearly impossible to disprove. If a wife claimed non-consummation, the husband had to undergo physical examination by court physicians. These medieval doctors would inspect his genitals, sometimes requiring him to demonstrate arousal in front of medical witnesses. The humiliation was designed to be so thorough that many men would agree to annulment rather than endure the process. Legal emasculation through medical scrutiny. Arthur, Prince of Wales, faced this nightmare scenario when he married Catherine of Aragon in 1501. After his death 5 months later, his brief marriage became the centre of decades of legal battles. Had consummation occurred, Arthur had reportedly boasted to his servants about his wedding night performance. But Catherine maintained they'd never been intimate. His alleged sexual success or failure would later determine England's religious identity. When Henry VIII sought annulment, the worst cases involved public trials where intimate details became court evidence. In 1562, Robert Dudley's first marriage faced annulment proceedings that required multiple witnesses to testify about his sexual capabilities. Servants, friends, even physicians gave detailed testimony about his private moments with his wife. The transcripts, preserved in legal archives, reveal the excruciating invasion of privacy that powerful men endured when marriages needed dissolving for political reasons. Some grooms developed elaborate strategies to avoid the pressure. They would arrange for loyal servants to provide false testimony about sounds from the bedchamber. Others negotiated with their wives beforehand, agreeing to claim consummation whether it occurred or not. The most desperate hired prostitutes to coach them on sexual techniques before their wedding nights. Anything to avoid the legal and social consequences of being labelled sexually inadequate by the Tudor court system. The age factor made everything crueler. Many grooms were children themselves, sometimes as young as 12 or 13 in the most politically motivated unions. Their bodies weren't physically ready for sexual performance, yet legal consummation was expected immediately. Medical records from the period describe boys suffering from what we'd now recognize as performance anxiety, so severe it caused physical illness, fever, inability to eat, even temporary paralysis from fear. Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, wrote privately about his nephew's wedding night terror in 1547. The boy was 14, married to a girl he'd met twice before the ceremony. He spent the entire bedding ceremony weeping, unable to approach his bride despite the encouragement of witnesses. The marriage was quietly annulled 6 months later, but not before the family's reputation suffered permanent damage from whispered rumors about the boy's inadequacy. Religious pressure compounded the sexual demands. Protestant reformers taught that marriage was a spiritual union requiring physical consummation to be complete before God. Catholic doctrine held similar views. This meant failure to consummate wasn't just legal inadequacy, it was spiritual failure. Grooms carried the weight of disappointing not only their families and witnesses, but also their understanding of divine expectation. The psychological burden was crushing for devout young men. The aftermath of failed consummation could last years. Legal proceedings to prove or disprove sexual inadequacy involved repeated testimonies, medical examinations, and public humiliation. Meanwhile, the unconsummated husband remained in legal limbo, unable to remarry, inherit certain properties, or father legitimate heirs. Some men lived decades under clouds of sexual suspicion, their every relationship scrutinized for signs of the inadequacy that supposedly defined their first marriage's failure. The bloodied sheet tradition added another layer of pressure for grooms. They weren't just expected to consummate the marriage, they were expected to do so in a way that produced evidence of their bride's virginity. If no blood appeared, both spouses faced questioning. Was she not a virgin? Was he not forceful enough? The physical proof became a test of both his sexual competence and his ability to assert masculine dominance in the most intimate moment. Some Tudor-era physicians wrote treatises on helping young husbands prepare for their wedding nights. These manuals, with titles like The Married Man's Companion, offered advice on diet, exercise, and mental preparation for sexual performance under pressure. The very existence of such guides reveals how widespread the anxiety was. Entire medical specialties developed around ensuring aristocratic grooms could perform their legal and biological duties when witnesses demanded proof. The social stigma followed failed grooms everywhere. Court gossip spread faster than plague in Tudor England. A man who couldn't consummate his marriage became the subject of whispered jokes, crude songs, and pointed exclusions from masculine activities. His friends would distance themselves, fearing association with his perceived weakness. Some men changed their names, moved to distant counties, or even fled to continental Europe to escape the reputation of sexual inadequacy that followed them. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, remember these young men trapped between duty and desire, performance and privacy. Their wedding nights weren't beginnings but examinations, tests they could fail with consequences lasting lifetimes. In our world, where intimacy happens behind closed doors, we've forgotten how recently marriage was a public performance requiring witnesses to verify our most private moments. Rest peacefully in your unwitnessed bedroom, a privilege Tudor grooms never knew. Chapter 12. Legal Battles. What if consummation can't be proven? Here's where Tudor marriage law gets truly ruthless. Imagine your most intimate moment becoming evidence in a courtroom, dissected by lawyers and judges who've never met you. When witnesses weren't present at a bedding ceremony, the entire marriage could collapse in court. Two spectacular cases show just how devastating this could be. Lives destroyed, dynasties ended, all because nobody could prove what happened behind closed bedroom doors one particular night. the legal framework was designed to be unforgiving. Marriage contracts included specific clauses about consummation because unconsummated unions could be annulled at any time. This wasn't theoretical. It happened regularly. Courts demanded testimony from bedding witnesses, physical evidence, or sworn statements from both parties. Without these, a marriage that seemed perfectly valid could be declared void years later. Property would revert, children would become illegitimate, everything a family had built could disappear with one judicial ruling. The most devastating case involved Lady Katherine Grey, younger sister to the executed Lady Jane Grey. In 1560, she secretly married Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. They thought love would be enough. They were catastrophically wrong. Their private ceremony took place at Hertford's London house, with only a handful of people present. No bedding witnesses, no formal documentation. No one realized these omissions would later destroy everything they'd tried to build together. When Catherine became pregnant in 1561, Queen Elizabeth discovered the marriage. Elizabeth was furious, not just because Catherine had married without royal permission, but because as Henry VIII's great niece, Catherine had a claim to the throne. The Queen ordered an investigation. Court lawyers pored over every detail of the wedding ceremony, searching for legal flaws they could exploit. The absence of proper witnesses became their weapon. Without bedding ceremony testimony, they could question whether consummation had ever occurred. The legal proceedings were merciless. Edward Seymour was imprisoned in the Tower and separated from Catherine before their trial. Under pressure and fearing execution, he couldn't provide strong testimony about their intimate life together. The court declared their marriage invalid in 1562. Their son, born in the Tower, was declared illegitimate. Catherine would spend the rest of her life under house arrest, her children stripped of inheritance rights, all because no witnesses had watched them consummate their union that first night. Catherine's case wasn't just personal tragedy, it was political warfare disguised as legal procedure. Elizabeth needed to eliminate potential heirs to secure her own position. The missing witnesses gave her the perfect excuse. Catherine and Edward genuinely loved each other, had lived as husband and wife, had children together. None of that mattered. In Tudor England, legal technicalities could destroy lives completely. The absence of formal consummation proof became a death sentence for their family's future. Henry VIII's annulment from Anne of Cleves shows how powerful men could manipulate these same laws. In 1540, Henry wanted out of his fourth marriage for political reasons. His solution? Claim the marriage was never consummated. The twist: Henry himself had dismissed the traditional bedding witnesses, supposedly wanting privacy with his new bride. This decision, which seemed romantic at the time, became his legal escape route just months later when he wanted to marry Catherine Howard instead. Henry's testimony about Anne of Cleves was devastating and humiliating. He claimed he found her physically repulsive, that he couldn't perform his husbandly duties, that their marriage bed remained cold and untouched. Anne, a foreign princess who barely spoke English, couldn't effectively contradict his claims in court. Without witnesses to the bedding ceremony, there was no independent testimony to challenge the king's version of events. His word became legal fact, and their marriage was annulled within months. Anne of Cleves actually benefited from the annulment, receiving generous settlements and maintaining friendly relations with Henry afterward. But her case established a dangerous precedent. If the king could claim non-consummation to escape an unwanted marriage, what stopped other powerful men from doing the same? The legal system that was supposed to protect marriage had become a tool for ending marriages whenever convenient. The absence of witnesses created a loophole that could be exploited by anyone with enough political power. These cases revealed how the legal system valued evidence over truth. Catherine Grey and Edward Seymour clearly consummated their marriage. They had children together. But without witnesses to testify to that first night, their union could be legally questioned. Meanwhile, Henry VIII could claim non-consummation with Anne of Cleves despite sharing a bed for months. The law didn't care about reality. It cared about documentation, testimony, and proof that could be presented in court. The burden of proof fell heaviest on women. Male testimony was valued more highly than female testimony in Tudor courts. Wives couldn't easily contradict their husbands' claims about intimate matters without appearing immodest or dishonest. This legal structure meant that men could often initiate annulment proceedings with greater success than women. The system that required witnesses to protect marriage legitimacy actually made it easier for powerful men to escape unwanted unions while trapping women in legal limbo. The psychological toll on couples was enormous. Every marriage carried the hidden threat that intimate details might someday become public evidence in legal proceedings. This wasn't just about property or inheritance. It was about having your most private moments dissected by strangers in courtrooms. Young couples entering arranged marriages knew that their wedding night performance might determine their entire future legal status. The pressure must have been overwhelming for teenagers who barely knew each other. By the late Tudor period, legal scholars began questioning these practices. Some argued that marriage was a sacrament that shouldn't be subject to such invasive scrutiny. Others pointed out that the witness requirement created more problems than it solved, turning personal relationships into public performances. Protestant reformers especially criticized the bedding ceremony as a Catholic holdover that had no basis in Scripture. These voices grew stronger as ideas about marital privacy slowly began to emerge. The cases of Katherine Grey and Anne of Cleves became cautionary tales that influenced how later generations approached marriage law. Aristocratic families became more careful about documentation, ensuring witnesses were present even for private ceremonies. But they also began to recognize that laws requiring such intimate testimony were ultimately destructive to the institution they were meant to protect. The legal system slowly began shifting toward trusting couples' own testimony about their marriages. What's remarkable is how these legal battles shaped our modern understanding of marital privacy. The humiliation and injustice experienced by people like Katherine Grey helped demonstrate why intimate relationships needed protection from public scrutiny. Their suffering wasn't meaningless. It contributed to evolving ideas about where law should end and personal privacy should begin. The legal disasters of the Tudor era helped create the private marriage rights we take for granted today. As you drift off tonight, remember that your intimate relationships exist in a space of legal privacy that took centuries to establish. Katherine Grey died under house arrest because she couldn't prove her wedding night to a court's satisfaction. Anne of Cleves survived because she accepted public humiliation about her marriage bed. Their stories remind us that privacy in marriage isn't automatic. It's a right that was fought for, sometimes lost, and eventually won. Sleep well in the sanctuary of your own private world. Chapter 13. Resisting the Ritual, Subtle Rebellions. Not every Tudor couple submitted meekly to the bedding ceremony. Some found clever ways around it. Others refused outright. By the 1570s, a quiet revolution was brewing in England's bedchambers. Protestant voices grew bolder, questioning why biblical marriage needed pagan-style witnesses. These rebels, they risked scandal, legal challenges, even accusations of invalid unions. But they chose dignity over tradition. Their stories reveal how some couples reclaimed their wedding nights from public spectacle. The token bedding became the compromise of choice for many noble families. Picture this. Witnesses would escort the couple to the bedchamber, see them placed in bed together, then immediately withdraw. No waiting, no listening, no verification beyond that single moment. Lady Margaret Cliffe pioneered this approach in 1555, arguing that witnesses confirming the couple's presence in bed was sufficient proof of intent. Her marriage contract specifically limited witness obligations to placement only. Other families quietly adopted similar language. Some couples went further, complete refusal. In 1563, Sir Thomas Hoby and Lady Elizabeth Cooke shocked court society by dismissing all witnesses before their bedchamber door closed. Their families had agreed beforehand, but the scandal rippled through noble circles for months. Whispers suggested their marriage might be challenged. It never was. Their bold stance inspired other couples to follow suit, though few had the social standing to risk such defiance. The Hobys had calculated correctly. Their reputations were unassailable. Protestant reformers provided intellectual ammunition for these rebels. John Knox, the Scottish reformer, declared bedding ceremonies lewd customs borrowed from heathen nations. His 1558 pamphlet argued that biblical marriage required only consent before God, not community verification of consummation. English reformers echoed these sentiments, though more carefully under Elizabeth's watchful rule. They pointed to Scripture. Nowhere in the Bible did witnesses observe marital consummation. The practice was purely Catholic tradition, they argued, with no divine mandate. The biblical argument gained traction slowly. Reformist clergy began refusing to participate in bedding ceremonies, claiming it violated Christian modesty. Archbishop Matthew Parker, Elizabeth's first Archbishop of Canterbury, quietly discouraged the practice among lower-ranking nobles. He couldn't challenge royal traditions directly, but his influence filtered down through the ecclesiastical hierarchy. By 1570, many Protestant ministers would bless the marriage bed but leave before the couple retired. This small act of rebellion gave couples the excuse they needed. Creative solutions emerged from desperate couples. Some arranged for witnesses who were elderly or infirm, people who would fall asleep quickly or couldn't remain standing for long periods. Others chose witnesses known for their discretion and modern thinking. Lady Anne Bacon, mother of Francis Bacon, famously selected only female witnesses for her daughter's bedding in 1574, arguing that men had no place observing such intimate moments. This half measure satisfied legal requirements while preserving some feminine modesty. The swift dismissal technique became popular among younger nobles. Couples would enter the bedchamber, allow witnesses to see them in bed together, then the groom would immediately announce that consummation had occurred. Witnesses couldn't dispute this claim without admitting they hadn't actually observed anything. It was legal theatre. Everyone knew what was happening, but the fiction preserved both legal requirements and personal dignity. Court records show this approach used increasingly throughout the 1570s and 1580s. Some families negotiated witness limitations into marriage contracts beforehand. The 1579 contract between Lord Edward Russell and Elizabeth Long specified that witnesses could remain only until both parties were properly disposed in bed. After that, all persons would immediately withdraw and not return. This contractual approach protected couples legally while ensuring privacy. Other families copied this language, creating a new standard that gradually replaced traditional open-ended witness requirements. Smart lawyers enabled quiet revolution. Physical modifications to bedchambers aided resistance efforts. Some nobles installed heavy curtains around their beds that could be drawn completely closed, making witness observation impossible, while technically allowing their presence in the room. Others positioned screens or tapestries strategically. Lady Katherine Grey's daughter commissioned a bed with enclosed sides, essentially creating a private chamber within the bedchamber. These architectural solutions let couples comply with witness requirements while maintaining actual privacy. Form over substance, but effective. The merchant class led by example, showing that marriages could survive without elaborate witness protocols. Wealthy London merchants often celebrated marriages with great feasts but minimal bedding ceremonies. Their unions prospered without extensive witness verification, proving the practice wasn't essential for marital success. Some nobles began pointing to merchant marriages as evidence that witness requirements were outdated social customs, not legal necessities. The rising merchant class inadvertently became models for aristocratic reform. Foreign influence played a role in changing attitudes. Ambassadors from Protestant German courts described their wedding customs, which emphasized privacy and personal dignity. French Huguenot refugees shared stories of marriages conducted without invasive witness requirements. These international perspectives gave English reformers ammunition, suggesting that England's bedding ceremonies were unnecessarily extreme compared to other Christian nations. Elizabeth's court, always sensitive to international opinion, began quietly discouraging the most intrusive aspects of traditional bedding practices. Medical arguments emerged as another form of resistance. Physicians began arguing that traumatic wedding nights caused lasting psychological damage, particularly to young brides. Dr. William Turner, Elizabeth's court physician, wrote privately that witnessed consummation created unnatural fears and revulsions that harmed marital relations for years afterward. While these medical opinions weren't published widely, they circulated among noble families and provided scientific justification for abandoning traditional practices. The rise of romantic literature also influenced changing attitudes toward marriage privacy. Poets and playwrights began celebrating intimate love rather than public duty. While these works couldn't directly challenge bedding ceremonies, they promoted ideals of private devotion and personal choice that made witnessed consummation seem crude and outdated. Young nobles, influenced by romantic poetry, increasingly saw traditional bedding practices as obstacles to true marital intimacy. Cultural shifts preceded legal changes by decades. Even Queen Elizabeth inadvertently encouraged resistance by remaining unmarried. Her refusal to submit to marriage negotiations, partly due to horror at the public nature of royal wedding ceremonies, sent a powerful message about personal autonomy. While she couldn't publicly condemn bedding practices that her own courtiers followed, her private comments expressed sympathy for couples seeking greater privacy. Her influence, though indirect, made resistance to traditional customs more socially acceptable among her courtiers. Legal challenges to witness requirements gradually weakened the practice's foundations. Lawyers began arguing that intent to consummate, demonstrated by sharing a bed, was legally equivalent to witness consummation. Church courts, influenced by Protestant theology, became more accepting of marriages without extensive witness testimony. By 1590, several high-profile annulment cases failed because courts ruled that witness testimony wasn't essential for proving valid marriage. The legal basis for required witnesses was quietly crumbling. These quiet rebellions transformed English marriage customs more effectively than any royal decree could have. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, witnessed bedding ceremonies had become optional for many noble families rather than mandatory requirements. Couples who chose privacy weren't automatically suspected of invalid marriages. The rebels had won, not through dramatic confrontation, but through persistent quiet resistance that gradually normalized personal choice over public spectacle. Sometimes the most effective revolutions happen in bedchambers, not battlefields. Chapter 14: Common Class Experiences. While noble families subjected their children to witnessed bedding ceremonies, the common people lived in a different world entirely. For peasant couples, merchant families, and craftsmen's children, the wedding night carried no such burden of public verification. Their unions mattered to their immediate families, perhaps their village, but rarely to kingdoms or courts. Property stakes were measured in acres, not counties, in livestock, not titles. A blacksmith's daughter married to a baker's son faced no political consequences if their marriage failed. No crown properties hung in the balance. No treaties depended on their fertility. This fundamental difference shaped everything about how common folk approached their wedding nights. The absence of witnesses wasn't neglect or oversight, it was simply unnecessary. Their marriage was their own business, not a matter of state security or dynastic survival. Common weddings still included bedding traditions, but these were celebrations rather than legal proceedings. Friends and family might escort the couple to their chamber with songs, ale, and good-natured ribbing. They'd scatter flower petals, make jokes about fertility, and offer toasts to the new union. But then, they left. The couple was allowed privacy that noble families couldn't afford to give. Intimacy became personal, rather than political. Village priests blessed common marriages with the same words used for nobility, but the follow-up was different. No one questioned whether consummation had occurred, unless one party later sought annulment, which was expensive and rare for people living on modest incomes. The assumption was that married couples would naturally fulfill their duties without supervision. Trust replaced surveillance. Privacy replaced verification. The bedroom remained sacred, not scrutinized. For common women, this privacy was a double-edged gift. While they escaped the humiliation of witnessed consummation, they also lacked the protection that formal documentation sometimes provided noble wives. If a husband later claimed impotence to escape his marriage, a peasant woman had fewer resources to fight such accusations. But in practice, this rarely mattered. Common marriages were more likely to endure, simply because alternatives were limited. The economic reality shaped everything. When your total wealth consists of a cottage, some chickens, and perhaps a small garden plot, there's little incentive for elaborate legal maneuvering around consummation. Marriage was about partnership in survival rather than alliance building. Couples needed each other's labor, skills, and companionship. Annulment meant starting over with fewer resources, a luxury most couldn't afford. Pragmatism trumped politics every time. Common folk developed their own marriage customs that emphasized community support without intrusion. Neighbors might hang ribbons on the couple's door, leave small gifts on their windowsill, or sing beneath their windows for good luck. These gestures blessed the union without violating its privacy. The community celebrated the marriage while respecting the couple's intimate space, a balance that eluded the aristocracy entirely. Even when common marriages faced difficulties, the solutions remained private. Village-wise women might counsel struggling couples about fertility or marital harmony. Local priests offered spiritual guidance, but there were no courts full of witnesses ready to testify about bedroom activities. Problems were solved within families and communities, not legal systems. This created space for healing and reconciliation that formal procedures often destroyed. The absence of witnessed bedding didn't mean common marriages were less valid or meaningful. Instead, it reflected a different understanding of what marriage meant. For peasants and merchants, marriage was primarily about creating a household, raising children, and building a life together. Romance, while valued, wasn't expected to overcome dynastic obligations because there weren't any. Love had room to grow naturally without political pressure. Common women often had more input in choosing their partners than noble daughters. While parents still arranged many matches, especially those involving property or trade connections, the stakes were lower. A baker's daughter who refused her father's choice of husband faced disapproval, not political catastrophe. This gave common women slightly more agency in their intimate lives, though still limited by the standards of their time and social expectations. Seasonal patterns affected common marriages differently than noble ones. Peasant weddings clustered after harvest when families had resources for modest celebrations. The timing was practical, not political. No one worried about coordinating with court calendars or diplomatic schedules. This meant couples could marry when they felt ready, when their families could afford it, when the community could spare time for celebration, timing based on human needs rather than state requirements. The contrast reveals how class shaped every aspect of intimate life. While noble couples performed consummation before audiences, common couples discovered each other in private. This privacy allowed relationships to develop more organically. Without the pressure of producing heirs to secure kingdoms, common couples could focus on building partnerships. Their children mattered deeply to them, but not to history books, which sometimes made them more precious, not less. Common folk weren't entirely free from marriage politics, but the scale was human rather than national. A miller might arrange his daughter's marriage to secure favourable grain contracts. A craftsman might seek a son-in-law to inherit his shop, but these negotiations happened over kitchen tables, not in palace chambers. The stakes were measured in personal security and family stability, not in kingdoms won or lost through strategic reproduction. Ironically, this freedom from formal bedding ceremonies may have produced happier marriages. Without the trauma of public humiliation on their wedding night, common couples could approach intimacy at their own pace. They could learn to trust each other without the immediate pressure of performing for witnesses. Physical and emotional intimacy could develop together rather than being forced to coincide in a single, scrutinized moment. The common experience also shows how the bedding ceremony was fundamentally about property, not morality or tradition. When there was little property to protect, the ceremony disappeared. This wasn't because common folk were less moral or religious. They simply had fewer assets requiring legal protection. The humiliation was reserved for those whose marriages controlled significant wealth, revealing the practice's true mercenary nature beneath religious justification. Understanding common marriage practices helps us see the bedding ceremony for what it truly was. Not a universal custom, but a tool of property protection disguised as tradition. The majority of people in Tudor England married without witnesses to their consummation because they didn't need them. They had something the nobility often lacked, the freedom to approach their wedding night as husband and wife, not as performers in a legal transaction. Chapter 15. Reflecting on the bedding ceremony, its legacy and impact. As we close this exploration of Tudor wedding nights, it's worth stepping back to see what these rituals really meant. The bedding ceremony wasn't just about one humiliating night. It was a window into an entire worldview, one where women existed primarily as vessels for legitimate heirs, and marriage functioned as the most important business transaction imaginable. Think about what we've uncovered. In Tudor England, the idea that a couple might want privacy on their wedding night was almost incomprehensible. Privacy suggested secrecy. Secrecy suggested potential deception. And deception, well, that could unravel entire family fortunes. The witnesses weren't there to invade intimacy. In their minds, true intimacy couldn't exist until the marriage was legally unshakable. The bedding made it real. This practice reveals something profound about how our ancestors understood marriage itself. Love, romance, personal choice. These weren't just absent from aristocratic unions. They were actively dangerous. A marriage based on affection might prioritize the couple's happiness over family alliances. It might produce children who resembled neither parent, raising questions about legitimacy. Romantic love was unpredictable. Property law was not. The bedding ceremony was essentially a legal procedure, disguised as tradition. Every witness served as a potential court testimony. Every detail, from the blessed sheets to the priest's prayers, created a paper trail of legitimacy. When disputes arose decades later over inheritance or succession, these witnesses could testify under oath. They had seen the marriage properly consummated. The children born from it were legally unquestionable. But here's what's fascinating. The very existence of bedding ceremonies proves that people understood the difference between legal marriage and true consummation. They knew couples could lie. They knew political marriages might never become physical ones. The elaborate witness system existed precisely because trust wasn't enough. In a world where women had almost no legal rights, their word about their own intimate experiences meant absolutely nothing. The psychological toll on young couples must have been devastating. Imagine being 14 years old, meeting your spouse 3 days before the wedding, and knowing that your most intimate moment would be performed under scrutiny. Some never recovered from associating intimacy with humiliation, surveillance, and legal validation. Their marriages became duty-bound arrangements where affection, if it ever developed, remained secondary to obligation. Yet something remarkable happened over the following centuries. As England's economy shifted away from pure feudalism, as literacy increased, and as Protestant theology emphasized personal relationships with God, the idea of personal relationships between spouses began taking root. The same religious reformation that questioned papal authority eventually questioned paternal authority over marriage choices. Slowly, painfully, romantic love became socially acceptable. The decline of bedding ceremonies wasn't sudden. It happened gradually throughout the 1600s and 1700s, coinciding with what historians call the rise of companionate marriage. This new model suggested that spouses should be companions, friends, even lovers, not just breeding partners in property alliances. Privacy became valued because intimacy was finally seen as something beautiful rather than merely functional. By the 1750s, even aristocratic families were abandoning public beddings in favor of private ceremonies. Wedding nights became, well, private. This shift reflected deeper changes in how society viewed women, not as property to be transferred, but as individuals capable of consent, affection, and agency within marriage. The bedroom door could finally close because what happened behind it was no longer anyone else's legal business. The elimination of bedding ceremonies marked one of the earliest victories for marital privacy rights. Couples could finally develop intimacy without community oversight. They could fail, struggle, or succeed in building physical and emotional connections without witnesses, documentation, or legal validation. Marriage began its long, slow evolution from economic contract toward emotional partnership. Love became possible because privacy made it safe. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't universal. Well into the 1800s, some rural communities maintained modified bedding traditions, escorts to the bridal chamber, ribald songs, mock examinations of bedsheets. But the legal necessity had vanished. These became folk customs rather than evidence-gathering procedures. The difference was profound. Community celebration replaced community surveillance. Looking back, the bedding ceremony represents a worldview we can barely comprehend today. Women as property, marriage as business merger, intimacy as legal procedure, privacy as dangerous secrecy. Yet understanding this history helps us appreciate how revolutionary our modern assumptions really are. The idea that two people might marry for love, share intimacy without witnesses, and prioritize personal happiness, these weren't inevitable, they were hard-won. Perhaps most remarkably, the shift away from bedding ceremonies coincided with early conversations about women's rights. When marriages became private, women gained their first real sanctuary from public scrutiny. Their bedrooms became spaces where they could exercise a form of agency, saying yes or no, setting boundaries, developing preferences. Privacy created the possibility for consent. Consent created the foundation for equality. Today, we take marital privacy so completely for granted that the Tudor bedding ceremony seems almost mythological. The idea that strangers might witness our wedding night feels absurd, invasive, traumatic. But this comfort we enjoy, this absolute assumption that our intimate lives belong to us alone, emerged from centuries of gradual social evolution. Every generation fought for slightly more personal autonomy than the last. The bedding ceremony's legacy isn't just historical curiosity. It reminds us how recently women gained basic rights to privacy, consent, and agency within marriage. How recently love became socially acceptable as the foundation for marriage. How recently the bedroom became private space rather than legal courtroom. These changes seem obvious now, but they represent profound shifts in human values, law, and social structure. As you drift off tonight in the privacy of your own room, remember the Tudor couples who couldn't. Their sacrifice, their humiliation under public scrutiny, helped create the world where intimacy can be private, marriages can be chosen, and love can flourish without legal witnesses. Sometimes progress happens one closed bedroom door at a time. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this journey through history's most private moments.